Good day. This is the recorded lecture for Chapter 6. Chapter 6 covers population biology, and it is assigned for week 4. Your chapter opens with a discussion about bluefin tuna, and the question is, how long can we fish? Some modern fish nets are larger than jumbo jets, in fact larger than several jumbo jets. Population biology allows us to identify overfishing. With population biology, we can model sustainable catch rates and warn about how quickly the species might disappear at current capture rates. In this chapter, we'll examine the main concepts of population biology and the use of these concepts in environmental science, particularly conservation. Does a fish net the size of several 747s sound like overfishing to you? This is a shot of a school of about 400 tons of jack mackerel encircled by a Chilean purse seiner, is the correct term, but it's about the size that we're talking about. There's a group called Oceana that I've put on the website, and it publishes a State of the World's Fisheries report. This report estimates that all major commercial fisheries will collapse within the next 50 years if current trends are not reversed. The specific story in your opening case study is about the bluefin tuna. Bluefin tuna are top predators. They're big and fast enough to eat almost anything they encounter. They can grow to over 12 feet, and they can weigh as much as 1,400 pounds. That's a big fish. Bluefins migrate thousands of kilometers around the world's oceans. Atlantic bluefins spawned in the Mediterranean travel across the Atlantic and to Iceland as they grow. This fish had very little commercial value until the 1960s, when a market developed for bluefin sushi and sashimi. Right here in California, you might have developed a taste for this particular cuisine. The bluefin is unusually high in fat content, which gives it a strong taste when cooked, but its raw flesh is considered especially flavorful. Japan has always been the leader in the raw fish market, consuming 80% of the world's bluefin tuna, but other markets have grown recently in China, in the United States, and elsewhere. Biologists warn that overfishing has cut this population by 70 to 80% and is driving the bluefin toward extinction. On the other side, the fishing industry and traders in Japanese sushi are unwilling to sacrifice the enormous profits it brings. The International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tuna, ICAT, is in charge of protecting the tuna, and also marlin, swordfish, and other species by setting sustainable catch limits. The self-policing ICAT structure has so far failed to conserve the Atlantic tuna. So what can you do? Try not to eat overfished fish. Download the Pocket Guide from the Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch site, and a link is provided on our website for the class. Good local choices where we live are Dungeness crab, wild salmon, albacore, skipjack, or yellowfin tuna. We will discuss individual efforts that you can make as we go forward in other chapters. This is just one example. Also, I've put a couple of links on the website. So contrast ICAT, which is what we're talking about, with our own Pacific Coast Fisheries Management Council, which regulates salmon fishing. This graph shows the bluefin tuna catch in the Atlantic since 1950. Note the differences between allowable, sustainable, and actual catch estimates. The bottom graph shows a worldwide assessment of the state of our fisheries. This is the outline of what we'll cover in this chapter. We'll look at the dynamics of population growth, factors that affect population growth, survival and regulation of population growth, and also maintaining populations with a little discussion on conservation biology as it applies to populations. So here's the question again, how long can we fish? How can we predict the impacts of human actions on different types of organisms? And what are acceptable harvest limits? These questions have to be answered by understanding population dynamics. All populations exhibit exponential growth. The cockroach is a great example of showing how population growth works without limits. Follow this chart on page 119 of your book. First, measure a rate of growth. You can do this with any species. We're going to use cockroaches as the example. So start with 2 cockroaches, one male and one female, and suppose they can lay eggs and increase to about 20 cockroaches in the course of 3 months. So notice we're measuring a 3-month time interval here. You can describe the rate of growth, or R, per adult in one time interval or 3-month period like this. R equals 20 per 2 adults, or 10 per adult, so R equals 10. So you can see that 10 in the column under R there. Once you have the value for R, you can fill in the table. You can then represent this graphically. Although populations have an intrinsic ability to grow exponentially, eventually limitations will set in. Running out of food is one example. Carrying capacity that we'll introduce, and the term is important, is the number of biomass or numbers that can be supported in a certain area without depleting resources. If you translate the previous table into a formula, here's how you express the rate of increase and show it graphically. Stop here and make sure you understand the terms N, R, and T. So read this part of your book a little bit. Population biology is quite dependent on mathematics. You can adjust the equation by introducing a term for change, or D. D is the change in numbers of individuals, or N, per a change in time, or delta T, which equals the rate of increase in R times the population size. These mathematical models are used all the time to study populations. Exponential growth produces a J-shaped curve, as shown here on the left. A population can only grow at an exponential rate this fast if nothing limits its growth, and we'll talk about limiting factors later. All environments have a limited capacity to provide food and other resources for a particular species, and so at some point that species is going to slow down in terms of its growth rate, depicted by the S-shaped curve on the right. So carrying capacity is the term, again, for the number of individuals or biomass of a species that can be supported in a certain area without depleting resources. So you can see carrying capacity is sort of reached on the left at a certain level where the growth rate levels off. Eventually, a rapidly growing population reaches carrying capacity, or in some cases may overshoot the carrying capacity. Shortages of food and other resources eventually lead to a population crash or rapid dieback. So all kinds of limiting factors work to control growth, and we'll go into those a little bit later. One of the major ones that's quite intuitive is the competition for resources, which we've already talked about in terms of species competition and various community dynamics in previous chapters. So as we bring in the discussion of population dynamics, we can start asking some questions. Why do we have communities of species interacting in the first place? One of the mysteries when you first look at communities is why are there multiple species at all? We looked at some of the mechanisms for speciation, and we also studied microevolution. But one way is to understand one species. That is, understand one species and its population behavior. If you look at any species, they will, left alone, as you can see from these curves, grow exponentially. All species reproduce more offspring than is required for replacement of the parents. If all species are doing this, this sets up competition between species for limited resources. Over time, species evolve habits or behaviors that improve their survival against the different selective forces being placed on them. So theoretically, all species achieve a balanced carrying capacity in the environments that they live in to remain successful. So we've talked about this idea before, but this is a little bit different take on it. Within this theoretical balancing, as I just said, populations can tend to oscillate around carrying capacity. This figure, which is 6.5 in your book on page 120, shows kind of a J-curve or exponential growth curve with an overshoot of carrying capacity. Exponential growth in an unrestrained population leads to a population crash and oscillations below formal levels. After the overshoot, carrying capacity may be reduced because of damage to the resources of the habitat. So this example presents moose populations on Isle Royale in Lake Superior and how this phenomenon kind of works. Some species kind of overshoot and crash and then sort of oscillate around carrying capacity. Other species tend to sort of balance out at carrying capacity. So again, this is the S-curve, or logistic growth curve, shown again. Over the long run, a conservative and predictable population dynamic may win the race over the exponential population dynamic. Species with this growth pattern tend to be what we call K-selected, and we're going to introduce those terms a little bit further in later slides. This is a term we can use to describe organisms that reproduce more conservatively with longer generation times, late sexual maturity, and fewer young, kind of like the wolves in this curve. So we're contrasting wolves and moose populations and their dynamics here. The opposite side of this approach is the cockroach, which we've already looked at, which can occupy many habitats, grow rapidly, mature early, produce many offspring with good dispersal abilities. But many of the offspring may not survive to maturity, and in some cases, the cockroach populations do eventually crash. If you were to model these populations in the Atlantic cod fishery and the Pacific salmon fishery, you can then explain why the two different populations with their different population behavior characteristics reach the different levels that we see. Life tables track mortality and survivorship. So the first step in constructing a model is to build a life table for the particular species that you're interested in. You can predict an individual's statistical chance of dying or surviving during each interval of the individual's lifetime. So you can see a kind of a life table that has been constructed for human populations here, similar to the one we did in the first couple of slides for the cockroaches. But now we've added a survivalship probability here in the fourth column. So when you're studying natural species, you can construct all kinds of life tables like this. This is a life table constructed for mountain lions based on several studies in the literature. A population composed of younger individuals indicates that the mountain lions who live in the wild 12 to 13 years do not survive long and are being killed at about an average rate of 2.86, age of 2.86 years. So you can see how you can construct these population tables and models and study what's going on. So now we're going to get into how population dynamics get adjusted, both sort of in a real time, but also how surviving in an environment affects the life strategy of populations. So we make a distinction between two reproductive strategies. We call these R-selected species and K-selected species. So let's look at these definitions a little bit more. The definition of an R-selected species is a species that tends to have rapid reproduction and high offspring mortality. They frequently overshoot the carrying capacity of their environment and display a boom-bust type of life cycle, the isolating graph that you saw earlier. They lack intrinsic population controls, unlike K-selected species. K-selected species tend to occupy lower trophic levels in food webs. So this is unlike K-selected species. So these R-selected species tend to occupy lower trophic levels in food webs, occupy disturbed habitats, and can often adapt to rapidly changing environments. A K-selected species is a contrast to this. These species reproduce more slowly, they occupy higher trophic levels, have fewer offspring, live longer lifespans, and have greater intrinsic controls of their population growth than R-selected species. So you can see these two strategies kind of depicted in this graph here. Another term for these two types of survivorship or lifestyle patterns are opportunistic for the R-selected species, shown in the graph labeled 3 here, and equilibrial for K-selected species, shown in the graph labeled 1 here. There are also species that move in between these two, and so the direct middle is called an intermediate or type 2. So let's look at some types of species that exhibit these two basic types of life survival strategies. So now we're looking at R-selected or type 3 here, opportunistic. They produce many offspring and they grow rapidly, and they can in unpredictable environments. So let's just, some of these will seem kind of obvious to you, but let's look at the loggerhead turtle or the sea turtle here. You may know that sea turtles come up on beaches to breed, and they lay eggs with many eggs in each nest. A typical loggerhead, using an example, will possibly produce 2 nests of 200 eggs each. The eggs hatch, and the hatchlings have no real protection. It's up to them to survive, so they have to make it out into the ocean, and there's usually huge losses of hatchlings. So this is typical of an R-selected species. This other species here is a 13-year locust, one of the cicadas. So the 13-year locust stays underground, hatches in gigantic numbers, so many that the current potential predator populations cannot feed on them all, and enough survive and they go underground for another 13 years. Weedy plant species tend to use this type of life history trait or survivorship strategy, and of course your little house mouse is another example. Now let's look at K-selected species. This is called equilibrial, or type 1. So elephant is an example. The elephants have long gestation periods, long child-rearing periods. The young elephants are often raised in a communal environment with other female elephants, and they take a long time to mature. Humans are an example, of course. Humpback whales are another example, where they produce calves every 2 to 3 years or so, and they spend quite a bit of time raising their calves to maturity. This table in your book contrasts the two types of species with a number of different criteria shown here. So which is more successful for increasing a population? Rapid reproduction or long survival within the carrying capacity? So different species, based on the different evolutionary pressures that they have, place their bets on different strategies. So many species will blend these characteristics between R-selected and K-selected. But still, it's useful to contrast the advantages and disadvantages as shown on this chart at the extremes of the continuum. It also helps if we view differences in terms of strategies of adaptation and the logic of different reproductive modes. So maybe you can look at this in the context of some species that you're interested in. Now we're going to look at factors that influence growth rates. So the rate, this R value that we've talked about, is a function of 4 main parts that you can construct the equation with: births, immigration, deaths, and emigration, or BIDE. Let's remind ourselves of the definition of a population, which is the number of individuals, or in some cases we measure that as biomass, of a single species at a given time in a given place. This chart represents sort of a simple graphic of how this model works. A population size represented by the box. Now that can be either numbers of individuals, or it can be measured as biomass, is a function of the births and members coming in through immigration. Outputs or reductions in population include deaths and members of the population going out, or emigration. So once you kind of understand how these dynamics work, you can start looking at a couple of species together. So we talked about species interaction, and so this is a graph showing how population dynamics will work in relation to another species. This is a snowshoe hare and Canada lynx as an example. For instance, so we talked about the moose and the wolves. In this case, this predator-prey relationship causes an oscillation in the population dynamics. So as conditions improve, the snowshoe hare, which is a little bit R-selected, it rapidly grows and overshoots carrying capacity. So it increases. Then there's more prey species for the lynx. So the lynx will take advantage of that and grow until the hare completes a dieback cycle, and then the lynx populations will then die back as well. So you can see how the lynx curves are sort of offset with the snowshoe hare curves here. This is called a boom-bust cycle, or a predator-prey cycle. So populations are affected by different factors. These include intrinsic factors, extrinsic factors, abiotic conditions, and biotic conditions. So intrinsic factors mean behavioral factors within the population. Extrinsic mean external factors that affect populations. And then we've talked about abiotic and biotic conditions. So tying population dynamics to our discussion of evolution in previous chapters, we can look at how populations maintain equilibrium, or how they don't, and the role of genetics and evolutionary processes in these. These are three terms that we are going to introduce. We've already talked about natural selection. Genetic drift and gene flow are two additional terms that we'll discuss. How these different factors play out is a question for population biology. And where we have some concerns is based on small, isolated populations that can undergo catastrophic declines due to environmental change, genetic problems, or stochastic, that means random or unpredictable events. A critical question in conservation biology is the minimum population size of a rare and endangered species required for long-term viability. This is particularly important when we have endangered species we're trying to manage for recovery. In a large population, these conditions for maintaining equilibrium are generally operative. The loss of a few individuals or the loss of genotypes makes little difference in the total gene pool in large populations. But in small populations, these factors have a dramatic effect. This graph is from a classic study in 1967 by R.H. MacArthur and E.O. Wilson that asks why it is that small islands far from the mainland generally have far fewer species than larger or nearer islands. Now, the answer to that might be kind of intuitive, but they propose the equilibrium theory of island biogeography, and it's relevant to small populations whether they're on an island or not. The idea that diversity in isolated habitats depends on rates of colonization and extinction, which depend on the size or isolation of an island. When populations are small, with less genetic diversity, such as on islands, they tend to be vulnerable to extinction, especially if colonization is low, as shown on these very remote islands, or this value SFS. This theory of balance between colonization and extinction, and the observation that small populations are especially likely to disappear, has been applied to explain species dynamics in many small isolated habitat fragments, whether on islands or not. This is an important concept for today. As humans fragment wild populations, they become like islands because colonization and interaction, that is, gene flow as a form of colonization, is eliminated by some type of barrier, such as urban areas or highways. These fragmented populations behave like island populations. Genetics plays an important role in the survival or extinction of small isolated populations. In large populations, genetic variation tends to persist in what is called Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, which is named after the scientist who first described why this occurs. If mating is random, there are no mutations or changes in genetic material, and there is no gene inflow or selective pressure for or against particular traits, random distribution of gene types will occur from sexual reproduction. That is, different gene types will be distributed in the offspring in the same ratio they occur in the parents, and genetic diversity is preserved. In a large population, these conditions for maintaining genetic equilibrium are generally operative. But in small populations, these conditions are not maintained, and populations can be very vulnerable to extinctions. This graph shows extinction rates of bird species on the California Channel Islands as a function of population size over 80 years. So now we can look at these terms again. The first one is genetic drift. Because small populations are especially likely to disappear, this concept of genetic drift applies more significantly to small populations or have populations fragmented in some way or another. In small populations, immigration, mortality, mutations, or chance mating events involving only a few individuals can greatly alter the genetic makeup of the whole population. We call gradual changes in the gene frequencies due to these random events genetic drift. I think genetic drift is that choice of words is a little hard to understand, so let me kind of explain it again. Genetic drift is a phenomenon where chance events have a big effect on the population. So for example, the best way to think about genetic drift is if you have a population, let's say there's a major catastrophic event that reduces the genetic diversity. A major catastrophic event might be a hurricane on an island, or a volcano blows up, or something like that. The genetic diversity is very much reduced, and that greatly reduces the diversity and leaves the population vulnerable to these chance events. There's a couple of phenomena that are related to genetic drift. For many species, the loss of genetic diversity causes a number of harmful effects that limit adaptability, reproduction, and species survival. We call this the bottleneck. The bottleneck occurs when just a few members of a species survive a catastrophic event, like the examples I gave you, or they colonize new habitat that's geographically isolated from other members of the same species. So any bad or genes that affect the survival of a population that are present may be overrepresented in subsequent generations. So this leads to survival problems. This slide sort of depicts the idea of the bottleneck effect. Now your book also discusses another term called the founder effect, and you can take a look at the book material and review that a little bit. But the point I'm trying to make here is that genetic diversity is one of the important elements of a population that is necessary for its long-term viability. So there's a minimal viable population size. There's some examples where we've reduced viable population sizes. And even though some of these populations have returned, there's a concern about their genetic viability in the long run. Cheetahs, for example, are nearly genetically identical. There's very little genetic diversity among the current cheetah population. Northern elephant seals were reduced to 100 seals in just one population, although they've increased in numbers. They have almost no genetic diversity. Grizzly bears were reduced to 1,200 animals in 6 isolated populations. So population models suggest that 600 bears in Yellowstone, which is one of these isolated populations, will be susceptible to potential crash or extinction events and may not survive a few generations. However, introducing 2 unrelated bears from another isolated population into this population could make a big difference. So let's talk about this a little bit more. Let's go back to the cheetahs. Cheetahs all appear to have undergone some kind of demographic bottleneck sometime in the not-too-distant past. All male cheetahs alive today appear to be nearly genetically identical, suggesting that they all share a single male ancestor. This lack of diversity is thought to be responsible for an extremely low fertility rate, a high abundance of abnormal sperm, and a low survival rate for offspring, all which are currently affecting the survival of the cheetah population. From a conservation standpoint, if the genetic diversity gets so low like this, we may do everything we can to increase numbers, but we may not be able to ensure their long-term survival. Before the European settlement, looking at the grizzly bear example, grizzlies roamed the Great Plains west to California and north to Alaska. Hunting and habitat destruction reduced the number of grizzlies from an estimated 100,000 in 1800 to less than 1,200 animals in 6 separate subpopulations that now occupy less than 1% of the historic range. These subpopulations sort of act as isolated populations or islands. So recovery target sizes based on the estimated environmental carrying capacities call for fewer than 100 bears for some subpopulations. So part of the problem is we could increase the population, but there's only so much habitat available. Conservation genetics predicts that a completely isolated population of 100 bears cannot be maintained for more than a few generations. Even the 600 bears now in the Yellowstone National Park will be susceptible to genetic problems if kept completely isolated. So, using population dynamics, biologists have run computer models. And the models suggest that translocating only 2 unrelated bears into this population every generation could greatly increase the survivability of the bear population in Yellowstone. So let's just look at the bear population a little bit more. So currently, the grizzly bear is listed as a threatened species in the contiguous United States and endangered in parts of Canada. This happened in 1975 in the U.S. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service listed the grizzly bear as a threatened species. What that does is it places the species under federal protection. In 2002, the Canadian government also listed some species of grizzly bears. You can see from the map on the right that the populations of grizzly bears are somewhat isolated from each other. This is not true in other places. There are other places in Alaska and parts of Canada where grizzlies have good populations and are actually legally shot by sport hunters. Listing under the Endangered Species Act in the United States requires agencies involved to work on recovery of that species. So the grizzly bear recovery plan was completed in 1982. Recovery is having some success in some of these populations. So in the Yellowstone population specifically, that was up to 600 bears, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service proposed to remove the Yellowstone grizzlies from the list of threatened species. This was controversial, partly because some of biologists and others felt that the population wasn't healthy enough, as we have discussed in earlier parts of this slide presentation and in the chapter. So this move was controversial, but in 2009 a federal judge reinstated protection for the bears, so a judge overruled the delisting of the grizzly bears in Yellowstone. The listing status has been maintained because of recent declines of the grizzly bear population. So the concern about the dynamic and the vulnerability of grizzly bears to declines seems to be bearing itself out. The current decline has been attributed to the loss of one of the bear's primary food sources, the whitebark pine. The whitebark pine is dying off due to climate changes. So a federal judge just recently maintained the listing status of grizzlies until the effects of climate change could be studied, and that happened in 2011. Report on this is due in 2014. So what I'm giving you here is sort of a specific conservation example that you could follow in the context of this population dynamic discussion. This is a map of the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative. This is one of the efforts that's being made in order to try to solve the problem of this island or isolated population effect. This initiation is designed to connect isolated habitats for grizzlies, wolves, and other large migratory mammals that are isolated so that gene flow can occur between the populations, and the populations might be healthier as a whole. I put a link on your website if you want to study this particular initiative further. So in summary, given optimum conditions, populations of many organisms can grow exponentially. That is, they can expand at a constant rate per unit of time. This biotic potential can produce enormous populations that far surpass the carrying capacity of the environment if left unchecked. But no population grows at this rate forever. Sooner or later, predation, disease, starvation, or some other factor will cause the population to crash. Some species follow a boom-bust pattern. Other species have these intrinsic factors that stabilize their population. Most of the top predators have these intrinsic factors that limit their reproduction and prevent overpopulation. Overharvesting of species then, as we talked about in the tuna example, habitat destruction that we've talked about a little bit in this island or isolated population discussion, predator elimination, which has been a phenomenon throughout the West, introduction of exotic species, which we'll talk about in later chapters, and other forms of human disruption that we mentioned, that is, isolating habitats with urbanized or highways, for example, can also drive populations to boom in some cases or crash. So population dynamics are an important part of conservation biology. This is the end of the Chapter 6 Population Biology presentation.